"I need a wife and you need strong sons," the giant cowboy declared to the lonely teacher. Those words echoed through the small-town schoolhouse, changing everything in an instant. The proposition was as bold as the man who made it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Abigail Johnson stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror hanging in the schoolhouse's modest washroom. 33 years had etched fine lines around her eyes, eyes that her mother once said changed color with her moods. Today, they appeared a dull gray, matching the overcast skies that threatened Cedar Valley with an early autumn storm. The schoolteacher smoothed her simple brown dress and tucked a stray strand of hair back into her tight bun. Her life had settled into a predictable rhythm, ringing the brass bell each morning, guiding rough-handed ranchers' children through their letters and numbers, and returning alone to her small cottage at dusk. Marriage had once seemed inevitable, but those dreams had withered like prairie flowers in August heat. "Miss Johnson?" a child's voice called from the classroom. "There's a man here to see you." Abigail stepped into the main room and felt the air change. Lucas Smith filled the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame. The largest rancher in 3 counties removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver. The children gaped at him. Most had only glimpsed the man from afar, riding the boundaries of his vast property. "Children, continue with your sums," she instructed, her voice steadier than her pulse. "I'll return shortly." The wooden porch creaked beneath Lucas's weight as they stepped outside. Wind whipped across the valley, carrying the scent of sage and coming rain. Abigail wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling diminutive beside his towering frame. "Miss Johnson," he began, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder, "I've come with a proposition." The teacher waited, watching his weathered hands grip his hat. Those hands had built fences, broken horses, and according to local legend, once fought off a mountain lion with nothing but a hunting knife. "I need a wife," Lucas stated plainly, meeting her gaze with eyes the color of a winter sky. "And you need strong sons to guard your winters." Abigail's breath caught. No flowery courtship, no pretense of romance, just stark honesty from a man known for his blunt words and fair dealings. "Mr. Smith, you're respected in this town," he continued. "I need someone with sense and education, someone who won't wilt under the harshness of ranch life." His expression remained unchanged, but something in his voice softened. "You need security, protection, a future beyond this schoolhouse." The wind gusted harder, rattling the schoolhouse windows. Inside, a child laughed, the sound carrying through the thin walls. Abigail studied Lucas Smith's face, searching for cruelty or mockery, but finding only straightforward intention. In that moment, standing on the weathered porch with Cedar Valley spread before them, Abigail felt her carefully ordered world shift beneath her feet like sand in a sudden storm. Lucas Smith offered no poetry, no tender promises of devotion. His proposal stood stark and unadorned as the Cedar Valley landscape itself. The towering rancher simply laid out the facts as he saw them. Two people facing the harsh realities of frontier life could fare better together than apart. "I respect your position as a teacher, Miss Johnson," he said, his deep voice steady as he stood on her porch that evening. "But we both know how this town talks. A woman alone faces challenges that grow with each passing winter." Abigail knew this truth all too well. The whispers had started years ago, pitying at first, then increasingly judgmental as she remained unmarried. The school board's subtle hints about proper examples for the children had grown more pointed lately. The prairie showed no mercy to those who couldn't adapt. Winters brought isolation and danger. Summers brought drought and uncertainty. Even the strongest struggled alone, and Abigail had felt her resolve weakening with each passing season. "I'll provide for you," Lucas continued, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping. "You'll want for nothing material. You can continue teaching if you wish. I won't demand affection, just partnership." His honesty was refreshing in a world where most men would have dressed up such an arrangement with false sentiments. The rancher spoke plainly, and Abigail found herself respecting him for it. She studied his face, the lines etched by sun and wind, the steady gaze that met hers without flinching. This was a man who understood endurance. "I need time to consider," she said finally. But in the quiet of her small home that night, surrounded by books and memories, Abigail confronted her reality. Her independence had come at a steep price. The loneliness ate at her spirit during the long winter nights when the howling wind seemed to mock her solitude. 3 days later, she gave Lucas her answer, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Yes," she said simply, "I accept your proposal." The words hung between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. No passionate embrace followed, no tearful declarations, just a firm handshake that sealed their practical bargain. As Lucas departed with a respectful nod, Abigail felt something stir within her chest. Not love, certainly not that, but perhaps the awakening of dreams she had carefully buried years ago. Dreams of companionship, of belonging, of creating something lasting in this unforgiving land. She would be Mrs. Smith soon, a wife in name if not in heart. The thought terrified and steadied her all at once. Autumn swept over Cedar Valley with golden hues and whispering winds. Abigail Johnson watched the transformation from the schoolhouse window, her thoughts drifting to the strange turn her life had taken. 3 weeks had passed since she'd agreed to Lucas Smith's startlingly practical proposal, and each day brought subtle shifts in their careful arrangement. The rancher would arrive at dusk to escort her home, his massive frame casting long shadows across the dirt path. They walked in companionable silence most evenings, the space between them measured and proper. Yet sometimes, when the wind kicked up and bit through her shawl, he would position himself to block its force, a wordless gesture that spoke volumes. "The first frost will come early this year," Lucas remarked one evening as they approached their ranch house. His weathered hands took her satchel of lesson plans with unexpected gentleness. "How can you tell?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man she'd agreed to share her life with. "The cottonwoods turned 3 days earlier than last year." He pointed toward the creek that bordered their property. "Nature speaks if you listen close enough." In the kitchen, they established quiet routines. She prepared simple meals while he tended the fire. They ate together, discussing practical matters, the condition of the barn roof, the progress of her students, the preparations needed for winter. No flowery declarations or romantic gestures, just the steady building of a partnership. Yet something was changing. Abigail noticed it in the way Lucas lingered at the table after supper, sharing stories of his cattle and the land he'd worked for 15 years. She felt it when their fingers accidentally brushed while passing the coffee pot, and neither pulled away quite as quickly as before. By lamplight, they sat reading, she with her literature, he with agricultural journals. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the room, and occasionally Abigail would glance up to find his eyes on her, thoughtful and questioning. "Do you regret it?" he asked one night, his deep voice barely audible above the wind rattling the windows. She considered her answer carefully. "No," she finally said. "It's different than I imagined, but not in a bad way." He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and returned to his reading. Later, alone in her room, Abigail traced the pattern of frost forming on her window. This marriage of convenience was becoming something else. Something unplanned and fragile as the first ice crystals of the season. She'd entered this arrangement for security and respectability, not expecting the quiet moments that now left her heart beating faster. Could such a rational agreement bloom into the life she never thought she'd have? As winter crept closer, the question haunted her every night. Abigail Johnson's life followed the predictable rhythm of seasons. Each morning, she rose before dawn, pinned her hair neatly at the nape of her neck, and prepared for another day at the weathered schoolhouse that had become her second home. The building itself stood as a testament to frontier determination, a single room with rough-hewn benches where the children of ranchers and shopkeepers gathered to learn their letters and sums. By 8 o'clock, she would have the pot-bellied stove crackling with warmth, her lesson plans arranged on the scarred oak desk. The familiar sound of the school bell would ring out across the valley, summoning her charges from miles around. She knew each child by name, temperament, and ability. The Thompson twins with their mischievous smiles, young Billy Carson, who struggled with his numbers but could recite poetry from memory. "Miss Johnson, I drew this for you," little Sarah Miller would say, offering a crumpled drawing of wildflowers. These small gestures sustained her through long days of arithmetic drills and spelling lessons. When afternoon shadows lengthened across the dusty floor, Abigail would dismiss her students, tidy the classroom, and begin her solitary walk home. That mile-long journey often felt like the loneliest part of her day. She would pass families gathering for supper, smoke rising from chimneys, the general store where Mrs. Thompson would wade from behind the counter, reminders of the connections she observed but couldn't fully claim as her own. Her small cottage waited at the edge of town, tidy and quiet, too quiet. Sometimes she would speak aloud just to hear a human voice break the silence. She had built this life carefully after the heartbreak that had driven her west, a broken engagement to a man who had chosen wealth over love. Independence had been her shield, her accomplishment, and, increasingly, her burden. Lucas Smith's proposal had shattered this careful routine like a stone through glass. The tall rancher's words echoed in her mind as she swept the schoolhouse floor, as she marked compositions, as she stared at her reflection before bed. "I need a wife, and you need strong sons to guard your winters." Everyone in Cedar Valley knew of Lucas. Children whispered stories of how he had once fought off a mountain lion with his bare hands. Townsfolk spoke of the time he had carried 3 injured men to safety during a blizzard. 6'6" of quiet strength, he rarely came to town meetings, but when he spoke, people listened. What would it mean to be his wife? Not a love match, but a partnership. Practical, like everything else in this unforgiving land. As Abigail extinguished her lamp each night, she wondered if practicality might offer what romance had failed to deliver, a place to truly belong. Abigail Johnson sat at her desk, correcting arithmetic papers as the late afternoon light filtered through the schoolhouse windows. She touched the silver locket at her throat, her mother's final gift, and remembered the words spoken to her years ago. "Your eyes, Abigail, they hold a softness that changes with your moods. They'll tell your story even when your lips stay silent." Those same eyes now reflected back at her from the small mirror she kept in her desk drawer. They had grown wistful lately, carrying shadows of longing she tried desperately to deny. The blue that had once been described as clear as summer sky now seemed overcast with clouds of quiet resignation. The schoolteacher closed her eyes briefly, listening to the wind whistling through the cracks in the weathered schoolhouse walls. Winter was approaching Cedar Valley with unforgiving swiftness. Soon the prairie would be blanketed in snow, the paths to the scattered homesteads treacherous and isolating. She gathered her papers, tucking them into her worn leather satchel. The community respected her work with their children, valued her dedication and learning. Parents nodded politely at church gatherings, occasionally invited her for Sunday dinners. Yet Abigail remained perpetually on the outside, the unmarried teacher, the woman who had passed the age when most frontier women had already borne 3 or 4 children. Through the window, she watched Mrs. Peterson walking with her youngest child, their hands linked as they headed toward the general store. The Thompson girls skipped ahead of their father as he loaded supplies into their wagon. Everywhere she looked, families moved in their own orbits, connected by invisible bonds of belonging. The ache of solitude pressed harder against her chest as she locked the schoolhouse door. Another winter threatened, her 5th alone in Cedar Valley. Each year, The cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones, into spaces that blankets and fires couldn't warm. Walking the mile to her small rented room behind the minister's house, Abigail hugged her shawl tighter. The thought of Lucas Smith's proposal returned unbidden. The rancher's words had been blunt, lacking poetry or pretense, yet they offered something her practical mind couldn't dismiss: partnership, security, purpose beyond the daily lessons. She paused at the crossroads, gazing toward the distant silhouette of his ranch on the horizon. What would it be like to belong there? To have a place that was truly hers? To no longer face the pitying glances from townsfolk who whispered that she was married to her schoolbooks? The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the rutted road. Abigail squared her shoulders and continued walking, her steps measured and deliberate. Whatever decision she made would change everything, and time, like winter itself, was steadily advancing. Lucas Smith's arrival at the schoolhouse was an event in itself. The children had been reciting their multiplication tables when his massive shadow darkened the doorway, causing every young voice to falter mid-number. He stood there like a mountain come to life, hat clutched respectfully in hands that could break a wild stallion or gentle a newborn calf with equal skill. Abigail Johnson felt her breath catch. The rancher's presence commanded attention without a single word spoken. The tallest man in Cedar Valley had to duck slightly to enter her domain, his broad shoulders nearly brushing both sides of the frame. The children stared wide-eyed at the local legend, the man rumored to have fought off a pack of wolves with nothing but a hunting knife during last winter's worst blizzard. "Miss Johnson," he said, his deep voice rolling her name with a gravity that silenced even the most restless children. "Might I have a word?" 20 pairs of curious eyes darted between their teacher and the imposing visitor. Abigail smoothed her skirts, conscious of how small she appeared next to him. "Children, continue with your arithmetic. I expect those problems completed when I return." Her voice remained steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "Sarah, you're in charge until then." The oldest girl nodded solemnly as Abigail followed the rancher onto the weathered porch. The October wind immediately assaulted them, carrying the scent of coming frost. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the bite of cold against her cheeks. Lucas stood with his back straight, hat still in hand. The wind ruffled his dark hair, revealing streaks of silver at the temples that spoke of hard years on the frontier. His face remained impassive, yet something in his eyes, a determination perhaps, made her heart quicken. "I apologize for interrupting your teaching," he said, his voice softer now that they were alone, though no less commanding. "It's quite all right, Mr. Smith." She folded her hands to keep them from trembling. "What brings you to the schoolhouse today?" The rancher shifted his weight, and for a moment, Abigail glimpsed something unexpected: hesitation in a man known for unwavering certainty. The prairie stretched behind him, golden grasses bending under the relentless wind, the vast openness emphasizing their isolation. She waited, acutely aware of the distance between the schoolhouse and town, of her vulnerability standing alone with the most powerful man in 3 counties. Yet strangely, she felt no fear, only curiosity about what could possibly bring Lucas Smith to seek her out. He cleared his throat, seeming to gather his thoughts like a man preparing to ford a dangerous river. The wind picked up, carrying a few dead leaves between them as she waited for him to speak. "I need a wife," Lucas Smith announced, his gaze unwavering. "And you need strong sons to guard your winters." Abigail felt her breath catch in her throat. The towering rancher stood before her on the schoolhouse porch, the autumn wind ruffling his dark hair as he waited for her response. His bluntness was jarring, yet there was something refreshingly honest about the way he spoke. No flowery words, no false promises. "Mr. Smith, she began, but he raised his weathered hand. "The winters are getting harder," he continued. "My ranch needs a woman's touch, and you need security. I've watched how the town treats you. Respect mixed with pity. A single woman out here faces challenges that grow with each passing year. He wasn't wrong. Abigail had noticed the changing attitudes of Cedar Valley's residents. The respect she'd earned as their teacher was increasingly shadowed by whispers about her unmarried status. At 33, the community had begun to view her differently, no longer as independent, but as someone to be pitied. I'm offering partnership, Miss Johnson, not romance. Lucas shifted his weight, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the wooden planks. My land is the largest in 3 counties. You'd want for nothing material. The rancher's reputation preceded him, a man whose word was unbreakable, whose strength was legendary among the valley's inhabitants. Stories circulated about him fighting off wolves bare-handed during blizzards, though Abigail suspected such tales were embellished. "And what of my teaching?" she asked, surprised by her own consideration of his proposal. "You'd continue. The children need education as much as you need purpose." His directness was almost comforting in its clarity. "I'm not looking to cage you, just to offer mutual benefit." Abigail studied his face, the lines etched by sun and wind, the steadiness in his eyes that spoke of reliability. This was no passionate suitor, but perhaps something more valuable on the frontier, a dependable ally against the harshness of prairie life. "The town's opinions are hardening," he added quietly. "A woman alone faces challenges that grow each year. Together we'd stand stronger." The bell inside the schoolhouse rang, signaling the end of the children's lunch hour. Abigail glanced back at the door, her sanctuary for so many years. "I need time to consider," she finally said. Lucas nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll return in 3 days for your answer." He turned to leave, then paused. "This isn't about feelings, Miss Johnson. It's about survival, and perhaps, in time, something more practical than love, but just as lasting." Abigail Johnson's heart pounded against her ribs as she stood on the schoolhouse porch, the prairie wind tugging at her skirts. Lucas Smith towered before her, his proposal hanging in the air between them like a tangible thing. She gripped the wooden railing, steadying herself against both the wind and the unexpected turn her life had just taken. "I need time to consider," she finally managed, her voice steadier than she felt. The rancher nodded, his weathered face betraying no disappointment. "Take what you need, Miss Johnson. My offer stands." She barely knew this man, beyond his reputation. Lucas was a fixture in Cedar Valley, his name spoken with respect in hushed conversations at the general store. His ranch sprawled across the horizon, the largest in 3 counties, and his word was considered unbreakable. When Lucas Smith made a promise, people said it was as solid as the land itself. That night, Abigail sat at her small table, a lamp casting shadows across her lesson plans. The solitude that had once felt like independence now pressed against her like a physical weight. Winter would arrive soon, bringing with it the isolation she dreaded more each year. Lucas had laid out his terms with startling clarity. He would provide a home, security, and respect. She could continue teaching. He wouldn't demand affection she couldn't give. In return, she would bring order to his household and perhaps someday children to his name. A partnership, he had called it, not a romance. Abigail traced the edge of her mother's ring, the only heirloom she possessed. What would her mother think of such an arrangement? Marriage had once meant love in her imagination, but at 33, practicality had slowly replaced those girlish dreams. The teacher considered her position in the community, respected but forever separate. The unmarried schoolmistress, invited to dinners out of obligation rather than desire for her company. The whispers had grown louder lately, speculation about her future once she was considered too old for her post. Lucas offered something she hadn't expected: honesty. No false promises or pretty words, just the truth of their situation and a path forward that might benefit them both. She found herself drawn to his sincerity more than anything else. In a world where people veiled their intentions behind pleasantries, his directness was refreshing. Frightening, yes, but also strangely compelling. Abigail stared into the darkness beyond her window. Fear of the unknown battled with fear of continuing alone. The rancher had planted a seed of possibility, and despite her reservations, she could feel it taking root. Abigail Johnson's path to Cedar Valley had been paved with broken promises and dashed hopes. 7 years ago, she had stood in her Sunday best, waiting for Edward to appear at the church altar. He never came. The scandal had driven her from her hometown in Pennsylvania, forcing her to accept a teaching position in this remote frontier settlement where no one knew her shame. The small leather trunk beneath her bed still held the unworn wedding dress, a reminder of dreams deferred. She had built a life here, respectable if solitary. The weathered schoolhouse had become her domain, her students the children she might never have. Each morning she rang the brass bell, summoning them to lessons with the same determined smile that hid her loneliness. Independence had its price. Every winter storm she faced alone, every roof leak she patched herself, every cord of wood she struggled to stack. The townsfolk respected her competence but kept their distance from the unmarried teacher who lived too proudly on her own. A woman wasn't meant to carry everything, Mrs. Thompson had once told her while wrapping flour at the general store. At the time, Abigail had bristled at the implication. Now watching Lucas Smith's broad shoulders as he repaired her broken porch step, a neighborly gesture before his proposal, she understood the exhaustion of self-reliance. Lucas didn't promise romance or passion. His words were practical, his intentions transparent. "We'd make a good team," he had said, his calloused hands resting on his knees as they sat on her porch. "You need security. I need someone with sense. We both need companionship." That night, Abigail sat at her small writing desk, the lamp casting shadows across the walls of her modest home. She traced the outline of her mother's ring, the only family heirloom she possessed. Her mother had married for love and found hardship. Perhaps marrying for practicality might yield something unexpected. The rancher's reputation was solid as the mountains. People spoke of his fairness, his unwavering word. He had built his spread from nothing, just as she had constructed her life here. They were both builders, survivors. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Valley, Abigail allowed herself to imagine a different future. Not just enduring, but thriving. A home with conversation over supper, shared burdens, perhaps even children with his height and her love of books. She wouldn't call it love, not yet, but possibility stirred within her chest. The teacher who had taught herself to expect nothing now wondered if she might, after all, deserve more. Word of Lucas Smith's proposal to Abigail Johnson spread through Cedar Valley faster than a prairie fire. By noon the following day, every resident within 10 miles seemed to have formed an opinion on the matter. Mrs. Thompson at the general store barely contained her excitement as she wrapped parcels in brown paper. "A practical arrangement, if you ask me," she told anyone who would listen. "A man needs a woman's touch, and that ranch is far too empty." Others were less charitable. Abigail overheard whispers as she walked to the schoolhouse, fragments that stung despite her determination to ignore them. "Desperate times call for desperate measures," muttered the blacksmith's wife to her companion. 33 and still unmarried. What choice does she have? Abigail lifted her chin and continued walking, her steps measured and deliberate. The opinions of others had shaped her life for too long. This decision, whatever it might be, would be hers alone. In the quiet of her small home, she found solace in familiar comforts. The brass school bell that had summoned generations of children sat on her mantel, a symbol of the independence she had carved for herself. She ran her fingers over her mother's silver ring, the only heirloom she possessed, wondering what advice her mother might have offered. Most telling was the contract Lucas had delivered. Written in his careful, unhurried script, it laid out terms both fair and considerate. He had anticipated her concerns before she voiced them. Her teaching position would remain hers, a monthly allowance would be provided for her personal needs, and separate sleeping quarters would be maintained until she decided otherwise. The document was as straightforward as the man himself. No flowery language or false promises, just honest terms for a partnership of equals. The rancher had even included a clause ensuring she could dissolve their arrangement should it prove unbearable, with provisions for her future security. That night, as lamplight cast long shadows across her small room, Abigail reread the contract. The prairie wind howled outside, a reminder of the harsh winters she had weathered alone. She thought of Lucas, not the towering figure of local legend who had fought off wolves and outlaws, but the man who had stood before her with hat in hand, offering not romance but respect. Perhaps there was something to be said for a union built on honesty rather than illusion. As she folded the contract and placed it beside her mother's ring, Abigail felt something unexpected stir within her. Not love, not yet, but possibility. Abigail Johnson sat at her small desk, the oil lamp casting long shadows across the marriage contract. Each paragraph had been written in Lucas's steady hand, not elegant, but clear and honest, like the man himself. She traced her finger over the clauses they had negotiated. Her continued position at the schoolhouse, a quarterly allowance of $15 for her personal needs, and most importantly, her own space within his home. The terms were more generous than she had expected. Many frontier wives surrendered their independence entirely, becoming little more than household servants with wedding bands. Lucas had agreed to her conditions without hesitation, as if he understood her need to remain herself even as she became his wife. "It's fair," she whispered to the empty room. Yet fairness wasn't what made her heart race whenever she considered her answer. It was the terrifying leap into the unknown, like standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her feet, uncertain if she would plummet or somehow learn to fly. The next morning at the general store, Mrs. Thompson cornered her between the flour barrels and the penny candy jar. The older woman's eyes sparkled with undisguised curiosity as she leaned close. "Is it true what they're saying, Miss Johnson? That Lucas Smith came calling with more than just pleasantries?" Abigail straightened her spine, feeling the weight of the town's attention. Cedar Valley thrived on such gossip, and she knew her decision would be dissected over every dinner table for months to come. "Yes," she replied, selecting a small packet of tea leaves. "Mr. Smith has asked me to marry him." Mrs. Thompson's eyebrows shot upward. "Well, and here I thought he'd never take a wife after all these years alone. They say he's built that big house just waiting for the right woman." She paused, clearly expecting more details. "And have you given him an answer, dear?" Abigail met the shopkeeper's gaze directly. "I'm considering it." "Considering? But surely—" "He asked me to marry him, and I'm considering it," Abigail repeated firmly. "Not for romance, but for the life I might build." She placed the tea on the counter. "We both know what we want from this arrangement." Mrs. Thompson's expression softened. "Sometimes the strongest marriages start that way, dear. My Harold and I were matched by our parents. Love grew later, like a garden after spring planting." Abigail paid for her purchase, tucking the packet into her basket. As she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, she realized something had shifted inside her. Speaking the truth aloud had made her decision more real, and somehow less frightening. The contract awaited her signature, and beyond it, a future she had never imagined for herself. Lucas Smith surprised Abigail with his ready acceptance of her terms. When she'd nervously presented her conditions, continuing her teaching position, maintaining separate quarters in his home, and keeping a small allowance from her salary, he'd simply nodded, his weathered face betraying no hint of displeasure. "A deal's only worth making if both sides can live with it," he'd said, his deep voice matter-of-fact. The rancher seemed to understand her need for independence, something she hadn't expected from a man of his reputation. They agreed to wed in 2 weeks' time, a date that loomed both too near and impossibly distant in Abigail's mind. Each morning as she rang the school bell, she wondered if she was making the right choice. Each evening as she walked home alone, she felt more certain she was. Lucas visited her modest boarding house twice during their engagement. Both times he brought practical gifts, a warm shawl for the coming winter, a sturdy leather-bound journal. "For your thoughts," he'd explained, his massive hands looking oddly gentle as he passed it to her. Abigail appreciated that he never tried to court her with false romance. Their arrangement was honest, and there was comfort in that clarity. She began packing her few belongings, books, her mother's china teacup, the quilt she'd sewn during her first lonely winter in Cedar Valley. Mrs. Thompson from the general store offered to help with wedding preparations. "Nothing fancy," Abigail insisted, "just practical and proper." The older woman nodded knowingly, but still slipped a length of blue ribbon into Abigail's package. "Every bride deserves something pretty," she whispered. Reverend Miller raised his bushy eyebrows when they approached him about the ceremony, but asked no uncomfortable questions. The teacher was grateful for his discretion. At night, Abigail would trace the words of Lucas's contract with her fingertip. He'd written it himself in a surprisingly elegant hand. The document outlined her freedoms rather than her obligations: the right to continue teaching, to maintain her own space, to be treated as an equal partner in their shared life. It wasn't love, but it was respect. Perhaps, Abigail thought as she folded her best blue dress for the ceremony, that was a firmer foundation than passion anyway. As the wedding day approached, she found herself less afraid and more resolved. This leap into the unknown wasn't a surrender, but a choice, perhaps the most deliberate choice she had ever made. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall beside the giant cowboy who had offered her not romance, but something she valued more: a chance to belong without disappearing. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, a rarity in Cedar Valley's unpredictable autumn weather. Abigail Johnson rose early, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons of her best blue dress, the one she'd worn to Christmas services for 3 years running. She pinned her hair with careful precision, studying her reflection in the small mirror above her wash basin. The woman staring back seemed both familiar and strange. Reverend Miller's church stood modest against the prairie landscape, its white clapboard exterior freshly painted for the occasion. Inside, a handful of neighbors had gathered, their curious eyes following Abigail as she clutched a small bouquet of purple and yellow wildflowers gathered from the schoolyard that morning. Mrs. Thompson from the general store nodded approvingly, while several of Abigail's students giggled behind cupped hands. The schoolteacher felt a flush rise to her cheeks as she took measured steps toward the altar where Lucas Smith waited, his massive frame somehow softened by the solemnity of the moment. He wore a clean black suit that strained slightly across his broad shoulders, his usually windswept hair tamed for the ceremony. "You look fine," he whispered as she reached his side, the simple compliment warming her more than elaborate poetry might have. Reverend Miller spoke of partnership and duty, of homes built on mutual respect rather than fleeting passion. The words suited their arrangement perfectly. When the time came to exchange vows, Lucas's deep voice filled the small space with straightforward promises: to provide, to protect, to honor her position as teacher and wife. His enormous hands dwarfed hers as they exchanged rings, his touch surprisingly gentle. Abigail's own vows came steadily, her teacher's voice clear and measured, as she promised loyalty, support, and respect. No mention of love. That wasn't their bargain. Yet something in the rancher's steady gaze made her voice catch on the final words. When the ceremony concluded, Lucas lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture so tender it caught her completely off guard. His beard brushed against her skin, and Abigail felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. This wasn't part of their contract, this moment of genuine tenderness that passed between them like a secret. The small gathering offered modest congratulations before dispersing. No elaborate celebration followed, just a simple meal at the ranch house that would now be her home. As they rode away in Lucas's wagon, Abigail found herself stealing glances at her husband's profile, wondering at the strange mixture of certainty and uncertainty that filled her heart. She was Abigail Smith now, a name change that represented far more than ink on paper. It was a new beginning crafted from necessity, yet somehow holding the faintest promise of something more. The ranch house stood tall against the prairie wind, its timber frame and sturdy stone foundation a testament to Lucas Smith's determination. Abigail stepped across the threshold, her new home far more substantial than the modest teacher's quarters she'd left behind. The scent of pine and leather greeted her, masculine but not unwelcoming. "It's not fancy," Lucas said, his deep voice echoing in the main room, "but it keeps the cold out." Abigail moved through the space, fingers trailing over evidence of his solitary existence. Well-worn books lined simple shelves, histories of the West, practical guides to ranching, and surprisingly, several volumes of poetry. In the corner stood a piano, its surface dusty and keys untouched for what appeared to be years. "My mother's," he explained, following her gaze. "Never learned to play myself." The kitchen told its own story, functional but sparse, with iron cookware hanging neatly and a wood stove that dominated the space. Everything was clean and orderly, yet it clearly awaited a woman's touch. Abigail could already envision herb bundles hanging from the rafters and the warmth of fresh bread filling the air. "Would you like to see your room?" the rancher asked, his massive frame somehow tentative in this moment. He led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The bedroom he'd prepared overlooked the eastern fields, where the morning sun would first touch the land. Abigail's breath caught at his thoughtfulness. A sturdy oak desk sat beneath the window, perfectly positioned for writing lesson plans. Beside it stood a brass lamp for late-night reading. "I thought you might need space for your schoolwork," Lucas said, his usual confidence wavering slightly. "Mrs. Thompson mentioned you often work into the evening." The bed was freshly made, with a quilt that showed signs of careful mending. A small bookshelf waited to be filled, and a cedar chest stood ready for her belongings. He'd even placed a vase of wildflowers on the nightstand, the same variety she'd carried at their simple ceremony. "You can change anything that doesn't suit," he added, watching her face carefully. Abigail turned to her new husband, seeing beyond his imposing height to the consideration that had gone into each detail. This practical man, who had proposed marriage as sensibly as one might suggest a business arrangement, had prepared for her arrival with unexpected care. "It's perfect," she said softly, and something inside her softened toward this giant of a man who had made room in his solitary world for her presence. The first week of married life at the Smith Ranch passed in a quiet rhythm of discovery. Abigail Johnson found herself observing Lucas's habits, how he rose before dawn, the methodical way he arranged tools in the barn, his gentle handling of even the most stubborn livestock. For his part, Lucas watched her too, noting how she hummed while grading papers and the careful way she pressed wildflowers between the pages of her books. Their conversations were sparse at first, practical exchanges about the day's needs. "The west fence needs mending," he might say over breakfast. "I'll be late returning from school today," she would reply, explaining about a student who needed extra help with arithmetic. On the third evening, Abigail returned from the schoolhouse to find Lucas standing awkwardly by the stove, a pot of rabbit stew simmering. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, avoiding her eyes as he ladled the hearty mixture into a bowl. The gesture touched her more than flowery words ever could. The next day, she noticed a patch of fertile soil near the kitchen window. Without asking permission, she began turning the earth, planting seeds she'd saved from the school's harvest celebration. Lucas said nothing, but the following morning, she discovered he'd installed a small fence to keep critters from her seedlings. "The children asked about you today," Abigail mentioned one evening as they sat on the porch, watching darkness settle over the prairie. "Tommy Wilson wants to know if you really fought a bear with your bare hands." Lucas's deep chuckle surprised her. "And what did you tell him?" "That I hadn't asked you yet," but bears generally prefer more sensible opponents. His smile, rare and transformative, warmed something inside her that had been cold for years. They developed small rituals: coffee at dawn, supper by lamplight, and the careful navigation of shared spaces. Lucas kept his boots outside the door without being asked. Abigail learned which books on his shelf were favorites, handling them with extra care. One night, a thunderstorm rattled the windows. The schoolteacher found herself standing in the doorway of the main room, watching as the rancher stoked the fire against the chill. Without a word, he moved aside, making space for her on the bench. They sat in companionable silence, listening to rain pound the roof. "This is a good house," she said finally. "Sturdy." "Built it to last," he replied, his voice low. "Meant for a family." The word hung between them, neither accusation nor promise, just a possibility. Abigail nodded, understanding that, like their marriage, this home was a foundation upon which something unexpected might grow. The awkwardness that had shadowed their first days together was gradually giving way to something neither had anticipated: comfort in each other's presence. The tranquility of their budding life together couldn't last forever. Like the sudden prairie storms that swept across Cedar Valley without warning, trouble arrived at their doorstep one crisp autumn morning. Henry Brown rode up to the ranch house, flanked by two hired hands. The neighboring rancher had always been ambitious, but the gleam in his eyes today spoke of something more dangerous than mere ambition. Abigail Johnson Smith stood on the porch, watching as Lucas stepped forward to meet them, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the yard. "Smith," Henry called out, his voice carrying across the property. "I've come about the north pasture. Got papers here saying it's rightfully mine." He waved a yellow document, the corners frayed and worn. Lucas remained steady, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that Abigail had rarely heard. "That land's been in my family for 20 years, Brown. Those papers won't hold up anywhere." The confrontation unfolded before her eyes, like the scene from one of her school books. Henry dismounted, thrusting the documents toward her husband. Lucas took them, examining each page with deliberate care while the tension thickened in the air. "These boundaries were redrawn 5 years back," Lucas said, handing the papers back. "Judge Miller settled it himself." Henry's face darkened. "Things change. I've got friends in the county seat now." The threat hung between them, unspoken but clear. For the first time since their practical arrangement began, Abigail truly understood what their union meant. Their marriage had made them both targets. Lucas no longer just a solitary rancher, but a man with someone to protect. And she no longer just the schoolteacher, but the wife of the most prosperous rancher for miles. Yet as she watched Lucas stand his ground, she realized they were stronger together. Without thinking, she moved to stand beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his arm. "Mr. Brown," she said, her teacher's voice firm and clear, "my husband's claim is legitimate. If you have concerns, the proper channels exist to address them." Henry's gaze shifted to her, surprise flickering across his features, before hardening into something uglier. "Didn't expect you to have your wife fight your battles, Smith." "She speaks for herself," Lucas replied, "and for this ranch, we both do." As Henry and his men rode away, tossing back promises to return, Abigail felt Lucas's hand brush against hers, a silent acknowledgement of the line they had just crossed. Their marriage of convenience had become an alliance against a common enemy, and somehow that shared purpose had bridged more distance between them than months of polite coexistence. That night, they sat at the kitchen table, planning their defense, no longer merely husband and wife in name, but true partners facing the gathering storm together. Abigail Johnson refused to cower in the shadow of danger. As Henry Brown's threats against their land grew more menacing, she approached Lucas with determination burning in her eyes. "I won't be the weak link in this fight," she declared, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Teach me to defend our home." Lucas studied his wife's face, noting the resolve that had replaced her usual gentle expression. Without a word, he retrieved his old Winchester rifle from above the fireplace and led her to the clearing behind their ranch house. "Hold it firm against your shoulder," the rancher instructed, his large hands adjusting her grip. "Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger." Day after day, Abigail practiced until her arms ached and her ears rang. The school teacher who once flinched at thunder now stood steady as she sent bullets through makeshift targets. Lucas watched with quiet pride as she transformed, not into someone new, but into a fuller version of the woman he'd chosen. "You're a natural," he told her one evening as they walked back toward the house, the setting sun painting the prairie gold. She smiled, feeling a strange sense of power. "I never thought I could do this." "I knew," he replied simply. Word of Henry's plans spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire. To Abigail's surprise, it wasn't just their battle anymore. Reverend Miller arrived first, Bible in one hand and shotgun in the other. Mrs. Thompson from the general store followed with her husband and sons, bringing ammunition and supplies. "We stand together," the Reverend announced. "This valley wasn't built by men who steal what isn't theirs." Old alliances reformed as neighbors who had barely spoken in years found common purpose. Even Mr. Peterson, who had once questioned Abigail's suitability as a teacher, positioned his wagon as a barricade near their property line. Around the fire that night, Lucas addressed the gathered townsfolk, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "I thank you all, but this isn't your fight." "It became our fight when Henry tried to buy the judge," Mrs. Thompson replied sharply. "If he takes your land today, whose will he claim tomorrow?" Abigail moved among their defenders, pouring coffee and listening to stories of past conflicts and resolutions. She realized that their marriage, once the subject of whispers and speculation, had become a symbol of something larger, the community's determination to protect its own. That night, as she cleaned her pistol by lamplight, Lucas sat beside her. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly. "Yes," she admitted, "but not enough to run." He nodded, understanding completely. They were no longer just two people bound by a practical arrangement. They were guardians of something worth fighting for. Abigail Johnson sat perched at her bedroom window, the weight of the pistol unfamiliar yet necessary in her trembling hands. The moon cast long shadows across the ranch, illuminating the fields where tomorrow's confrontation would unfold. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she contemplated the journey that had brought her here. Just months ago, she had been merely the spinster schoolteacher of Cedar Valley, lonely and resigned to her solitary existence. Now she was a wife, a partner in this sprawling ranch, and soon to be a defender of the home she had come to cherish. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here she sat, watching for the first signs of Henry's men. "You should rest," Lucas said softly, his large frame filling the doorway behind her. His voice, deep and steady, had become a comfort she hadn't expected to find in their practical arrangement. "I couldn't sleep even if I tried," she admitted, turning to face him. The rancher's eyes held concern, but also something that looked remarkably like pride. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. "You've shown more courage than most men I know, Abigail." She shook her head. "It's not courage, it's necessity." Her fingers tightened around the pistol. "This is our home. I won't let Henry Brown take it." Lucas covered her hand with his own. The calluses on his palm reminded her of his strength, of the life he had built through sheer determination. "Our home," he repeated, the words carrying weight neither had anticipated when they'd signed their marriage contract. They stayed like that until dawn painted the horizon in shades of amber and gold. The sound of approaching horses broke the morning stillness. Abigail rose, straightening her back and checking the pistol one final time. "They're here," she whispered. From the porch, they watched as Henry led a group of 7 men toward the ranch house. Behind them came an unexpected sight: wagons and riders from town. Reverend Miller, Mrs. Thompson from the general store, and at least 24 others formed a line behind Lucas and Abigail. "What's all this?" Henry called out, clearly surprised by the show of support. Lucas stepped forward, his stance protective yet not hiding Abigail. "This is Cedar Valley standing together," he answered. "Your false claims won't hold here." "We've seen your documents," Abigail added, her teacher's voice carrying across the yard. "And we've found the original deeds. The north pasture belongs to the Smith Ranch. It always has." Henry's face darkened with rage, but his men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the united front of townspeople. "You're making a mistake," Henry snarled, but his confidence was visibly shaken. "No," Abigail replied, feeling Lucas's steady presence beside her. "The mistake was thinking we would yield." The townspeople moved closer, a human barrier between the threat and the home Abigail had never expected to defend, or love, with such fierce determination. The standoff shattered the dawn's quiet. Henry Brown and his men charged across the field, guns blazing. Bullets whizzed through the air, splintering fence posts and kicking up dirt around the defenders. Abigail Johnson crouched behind a water trough, the pistol heavy in her trembling hands. 6 months ago, she'd never imagined herself in such a position, fighting for land, for home, for the man who'd proposed marriage as practically as one might suggest a business arrangement. "Stay down," Lucas shouted from his position by the barn. His voice carried over the chaos, steady and commanding. She nodded, though he couldn't see her. When one of Henry's men broke from cover and ran toward the house, Abigail steadied her aim. The recoil jarred her shoulder as she fired, missing the man but forcing him back. Her second shot struck the ground at his feet, sending him scrambling for safety. The schoolteacher's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't like target practice on empty cans. These were men intent on taking everything she and Lucas had built together. Across the yard, Lucas emerged from cover, his tall frame moving with surprising speed toward Henry. The rival rancher had separated from his men, perhaps believing himself safe from harm, while others did his fighting. "This ends now," Lucas growled, closing the distance between them. Henry's face contorted with shock, then hatred. He raised his pistol, but Lucas knocked it aside. Years of hard ranch work had made her husband powerful, and he lifted Henry by his shirt collar, rage burning in his eyes. "You threatened my land," Lucas snarled, landing a blow that sent Henry staggering. "My home." Another punch. "My wife." The words carried a possessiveness that made Abigail's breath catch. The smaller man crumpled to the ground, blood streaming from his nose. Lucas loomed over him, drawing his hunting knife from its sheath. The morning sun glinted off the blade as Henry cowered. "Lucas," Abigail called, abandoning her shelter to run toward them. "Don't do this." His shoulders tensed at her voice, but the knife remained poised. She could see the battle in his eyes. Justice against vengeance, the law against frontier retribution. "He doesn't deserve your mercy," Lucas said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you deserve a husband who isn't a killer." Abigail placed her hand on his arm. "The law will handle him now. We've won." Around them, the shooting had stopped. Henry's men, seeing their leader defeated, were surrendering to the townspeople, who'd come to stand with the Smiths. Lucas lowered the knife slowly, then tucked it away. He looked at Abigail with something new in his gaze, not just respect or partnership, but a tenderness that made her heart flutter despite the danger they'd just faced. "Let's go home," she whispered, and for the first time, the word felt completely true. The dust settled over Cedar Valley as Henry Brown was led away in shackles. His forged documents and hired guns had failed him, and the truth of his land-grabbing schemes had been exposed for all to see. The townsfolk gathered at Lucas's ranch that evening, celebrating not just the victory, but the unity that had saved their community. Abigail stood by the hearth, watching the faces illuminated by firelight. She caught Lucas's eye across the room, and something unspoken passed between them. When the last neighbor had departed, she retrieved her mother's ring from the small wooden box where she'd kept it all these years. "I'd like to wear it now," she said, her voice steady. "Not as a memory of what was lost, but as a promise of what we found. Lucas took the delicate band between his weathered fingers. The rancher's eyes, usually so guarded, shone with pride and something deeper as he slipped it onto her finger. His touch lingered, gentle despite his strength. "I offered you a bargain," he said, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "You've given me a home." Winter melted into spring, and spring blossomed into summer. The schoolhouse thrived under Abigail's care, her students flourishing as she taught them not just their letters and numbers, but courage and conviction. The teacher found herself changing too, standing taller, laughing more freely, no longer the solitary figure watching life from the margins. Lucas worked the land with renewed purpose, expanding the garden they'd started together, building a future neither had dared imagine when they'd made their practical arrangement. Their evenings grew longer, filled with conversation instead of silence, with plans instead of regrets. When autumn painted the prairie gold once more, Abigail felt the first flutter of life within her. She placed her hand over her growing belly, remembering Lucas's blunt proposal that day in the schoolyard. "I need a wife, and you need strong sons to guard your winters." The school bell rang clear across the valley on a crisp October morning, calling children to their lessons. But for the first time in years, Abigail wasn't there to answer it. Instead, she stood in the small room adjoining their bedroom, where Lucas had spent weeks crafting a cradle from oak as sturdy as himself. His arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting atop her head, as they gazed at the nursery bathed in morning light. The walls were adorned with pictures drawn by her students, and a small bookshelf waited to be filled with stories. "Our son will be strong," she murmured, leaning back against her husband's chest, "and wise." Lucas added, his hand covering hers, like his mother. What had begun as necessity had transformed into something neither could have predicted, a love built on respect, tested by fire, and strengthened by choice, against all odds.